Can you use math to help solve true crimes? It turns out you can to a degree, and we'll go over that in this video. I'm Deception Detective. I'm an attorney trained in statement analysis, and my main channel, Deception Detective, exists to expose lies and manipulation. This channel, DD Forum, exists to help solve those true crimes. In today's video, we'll go over a concept I posted about in the DD Forum, known as Bayesian thinking, and it's a tool I use when I approach true crime cases and suspects to be correct more often than I am wrong. And I know we're talking about math here, but once we get into it, it's not that complicated, and after I've explained it, it'll make a lot of sense in retrospect. It will seem obvious. So as you know, I am not a true crime junkie. I've only started looking at true crime more deeply because you guys, my audience, are interested in it. And I've really gotten into true crime after I came back to YouTube a few months ago. So this is a post I did in the DD forum at forum.deceptiondeck.com in the patron section 2 days ago. And it basically goes over the way that I approach true crime cases as someone who doesn't really get into the nitty-gritty of the case facts right away, if ever. Right? If you've followed my main channel, you know that I like to focus on the statements of the suspects because I think that is the heart of the case. After all, the suspects are the only people who know for sure whether they're guilty or not. Everything else is just speculation. So here's how I approach cases, and especially cases that involve missing children, which is another thing that you guys vote for, and I'm particularly passionate about when it comes to true crime, because there's nothing sadder than a missing kid, especially if the parents are responsible. Basically means the kid didn't have anyone in the world to rely on. Even their own mother and father betrayed them, which gets to me. So here's what I posted. I'm going to read it to you here, and then we'll go over the concept. So, while it's true that stereotypes can provide quick and good enough predictions for true crime analysis, for example, an alcoholic with a history of DUIs will likely drive drunk at some point. They fall short when assessing uncommon crimes like murder. So while you can stereotype people for common crimes, like if someone's missing a bunch of teeth and they're scratchy and itchy, they might be a drug addict. Or if they've got burst veins on their nose and a beer belly, they might be an alcoholic. Right? These are very common. But murder, even though it takes up a lot of space in the headlines and videos and news and public conversation, murder is actually very rare. It's very uncommon. So to illustrate this point in how we get tricked by commonalities versus uncommonalities, this is a question I posted on X, and let's see how you answer it. So I posted this poll on X, and it's going to expire in 20 hours. Here's the question. Amy, a fictional character, is an autistic teenager living with her mother and stepfather, Stan. Amy has been missing for over a month. Stan, who has a history of domestic abuse, did not immediately contact the police after Amy's disappearance. Based on this information, which of the following outcomes do you find more likely? Option 1, Amy ran away, or option 2, Amy was killed by Stan. And before you make your choice, remember, this is a fictional case, and it's about which of these two options is more likely to have happened, regardless of what actually happened. And if you're watching this video, you can see that so far there's 174 votes. 77% of people voted for Amy was killed by Stan. 23% of people voted for Amy ran away. And I predicted these results. So even though the poll's not over, here's what I wrote in the blog article 2 days ago. When I ran this poll on X, most people chose option 2, assuming that Stan killed Amy due to his stereotypical history of domestic abuse and his delay in contacting the police. And indeed, disabled stepchildren like Amy face significantly higher risks of physical abuse. And I pointed that out in another video. So here's my 2 cents about that case. So when I first spoke about this, the case of Sebastian Rogers, 2 weeks ago in another video that I did about Stephen Stearns, here's what I said about the case. Sebastian was a stepson, and this single fact increases his risk of abuse by his stepfather by 40 times. In other words, before you even listen to a word of the parents, statistically just be aware that if the kid is the stepchild, or in the case of Madeline Soto, right, the daughter of Stephen's girlfriend, the risk of abuse is far higher than with biological parents. All right, so now it's back to this present video. So even I was aware, right? I pointed out that stepchildren face a higher risk of being abused or harmed. Also, disabled stepchildren, as I pointed out later in that same video, face even higher risk. And I think that most people reading this question understood that fact, that a stepchild who is also disabled, who has a father who has a history of abuse, and who did not immediately call the police, this sounds like the stereotype of a murder. However, if you picked option 2, Amy was killed by Stan, you're overlooking the base rates. In other words, the general likelihood of an event occurring regardless of the specific facts. So in this case, the base rates, let's say we don't know anything about Amy, we don't know anything about Stan, we don't have any evidence, we're just coming into a case of a child who's been gone for a month, a teenager who's been gone for a month. The base rates are, what is the likelihood that the kid ran away, and what is the likelihood that the kid was murdered by their parents or one of their parents. And here's the base rates. In the US, there are 1.5 million teens who run away every year, compared to just 500 annual filicides, right? Murders, cases where a parent murders their kid. So the ratio is 3,000 to 1. So if you didn't know anything about this case, and you just heard that a kid has been missing, a teenager has been missing for a month, the correct choice is that Amy ran away. If you're going to bet, you should be betting on runaway every single time. If you're at the casino and your odds are 3,000 to 1, you need to go with the 3,000. Right? If there's a roulette wheel and one segment on it is white and 2,999 are red, you should be putting your money on red. And most people know this, right? So here's what I said later in the article, and this is what's going to explain everything. Although these exact ratios may not be commonly known, it is generally understood that teenagers are much more likely to run away than to be murdered. Right? So if you watching this, or even everyone who picked Amy was killed by Stan, they all know, they have a general idea that kids are more likely to run away than be murdered by their parents. But they still picked option 2. Why? The reason is a psychological phenomenon. The details about Stan were so visceral and biasing that they caused people to overlook the base rates. In other words, when you read this question, most people see these details about Stan, that he has a history of domestic abuse, that he didn't call the police right away, that he's not the biological father, that Amy is disabled. And all those facts seem much more important to them. In fact, they seem so important that they forget to even question or even think about anything outside of those facts, like the base rates, like the chances of a missing kid running away versus being murdered by their parents. And like I say here, this is a common phenomenon. And ironically, the solution is to simply provide less information. So when I rephrase the question, more people got it right. So more participants made the statistically correct choice and took base rates into account when the question was posed like this. So here's the second way I framed the question. I just said, Amy, a fictional character, is a teenager. Amy has been missing for over a month. Based on this information, which of the following outcomes do you find more likely? Amy ran away or Amy was murdered? So when I withheld all the information about Amy being autistic or being a stepchild, as well as information about Stan, people selected the statistically correct choice. 58% picked Amy ran away, and 42% picked Amy was murdered. So this exercise underscores the core of Bayesian reasoning. Bayesian reasoning, as far as we're concerned here, is simply the integration of statistical probabilities with specific evidence. So when most missing teenagers are runaway, but we still have some hints that a particular teenager was murdered, that specific evidence must be considered in light of the overall statistical understanding. Right, so just because a parent says something weird or there is a fact that would suggest that there's a higher probability that the kid was abused or murdered, like the kid being a stepchild. We need to factor that into that 3,000 to 1 ratio. So we have to consider all those things, and we can't forget to consider the base rates. And that's what happened the first time I asked the question. People got blinded by the details and forgot the base rates. Based on these details that I provided in the question, the correct answer is Amy ran away, even with all the details I provided. Right, so there are more stepfathers with a history of abuse who don't murder their kid than there are stepfathers with a history of abuse who murder their kid, right? So no matter which way you break it down, even if the likelihood is higher at that point with those facts, it's still overwhelmingly more likely that the kid ran away. So it's crucial to stay logical and update our predictions as new information emerges, right? So as we learn more, then we can update our rates. But going into the case or going into a situation, do consider the base rates, even if certain details stand out. For instance, while Stan's history of abuse is notable, it pales in comparison to something like the discovery of Amy's body, which would totally shift the likelihood away from her being a runaway. So if we found Amy's body, that would totally change things. Our calculation would have to change dramatically. And to make things more concrete, and to bring you back to 2 cases that we are looking at on the main channel, Madeline Soto and Sebastian Rogers, here's how this applies to real-world cases. So to make things more concrete, Bayesian thinking explains why I confidently assert that Stephen Stearns is behind Madeline Soto's murder. But I am still cautious about Chris Proudfoot's link to Sebastian Rogers' disappearance. Because although both cases happened around the same time, they both involved fathers who aren't the biological fathers of the kid. The crucial distinction here, which is why I'm not all in on the Proudfoots, the same way I'm all in on Stephen Stearns. The crucial distinction is the discovery of Madeline's body, whereas Sebastian is still missing. Does this mean that Chris Proudfoot is innocent? Of course not. But the way I'm thinking about the cases has to incorporate the pieces of evidence that would totally change the base rates. And it's also part of the reason that I'm not so quick to judge Nicole Kessinger, because statistically, the mistress doesn't go kill the entire family. right? So once we have this approach, then we can assess the statements with less bias and more rationally, because we have a wider framework of reality. Statistically, it's going to go the way the stats say. So Bayesian reasoning is more than statistical theory. It's an essential tool for making informed and impartial decisions. It grounds our judgment in reality and promotes critical evaluation of new information free from stereotype-induced bias. This methodology enhances our ability to tackle complex decisions from crime investigation to daily life choices with greater finesse. So I hope I explained that well. Basically, it all boils down to when you're approaching a case, first, consider the wider statistics of possibilities before zeroing in on one or two facts that are very visceral and immediately turn you against the suspect. More often than not, there are more people who meet that criteria that are innocent of a murder than there are people, than there are total murderers. And then I did post this in the DD Forum patron area. If you want to join the DD Forum, you can do so at forum.deceptiondeck.com. And if you want to be a patron, you can click the button on the forum. And I appreciate everyone who is a patron. And you can see that we've been discussing, me and a couple of the patrons, Kimberlina and Carrie Berry, who is also a mod over here in this section. And like everything I do is eventually free. So if you don't want to do that, that's perfectly fine too. Just like I'm doing now, I'm making a video about it. Until next time, stay true.